A 3-year-old child. Tiny hands. Uncertain steps. Standing at the edge of a marble staircase that dropped 20 feet to a cold stone floor below. And walking straight toward that edge, a 7-year-old boy. Eyes open, seeing nothing. His white cane had slipped from his fingers 2 rooms back. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know what was ahead of him. The security cameras caught everything. The butler was downstairs. The nanny was on a phone call. The billionaire father was in a board meeting 40 floors above Manhattan. The mother, gone for 3 years now. No one was watching. No one except a tiny little girl named Rosie, the maid's daughter. 2 years and 9 months old. Bare feet on marble. A half-eaten biscuit in one hand. Eyes locked on the boy walking toward the edge. She didn't understand danger the way adults do. She just understood one thing. Her friend Lucas was going somewhere wrong. So she ran. What happened in the next 11 seconds changed every single life in that mansion forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, I have to ask, where are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments below. Are you watching from the United States? The United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? India? Maybe Germany? Wherever you are in the world, I want you to know this story is going to stay with you. It stayed with me for a long time after I first heard it. So settle in. Get comfortable. Because what you're about to hear is one of the most emotional, heartwarming, and beautifully human stories I have ever had the privilege of telling. This is the story of Lucas Hargrove, the blind son of one of New York's most powerful men, and Rosie Mendez, a toddler who didn't know she was a hero. She just knew she loved her friend. Let's begin. The Hargrove Mansion on the Upper East Side of Manhattan was the kind of home that made strangers stop on the sidewalk and stare. 5 stories of limestone and glass. Iron gates with the family crest pressed into every bar. A private garden in the back that looked like someone had stolen a piece of Central Park and tucked it behind a wall. Security cameras on every corner. A staff of 14. A chef named Marcello, who had trained in Paris. A wine cellar that held bottles worth more than most people's cars. From the outside, it looked like perfection. From the inside, it echoed. That was the word the staff used when they talked about it among themselves in the kitchen after midnight. Echoed. Not in the way of a cathedral, which echoes with something holy and full. This house echoed the way an empty theater does, like something had once lived here that was now absent, and every sound just bounced off the walls looking for it. The something that was absent was Elena Hargrove. She had died 3 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in October, in a hospital room on the 4th floor of New York Presbyterian. A brain aneurysm. She was 31 years old. She had kissed her son on the forehead the night before and told him she would read to him in the morning. She never came back to do it. Her husband, Richard Hargrove, was 44 years old, the founder and CEO of Hargrove Capital, a man whose name appeared in Forbes every year and on the lips of financial analysts every morning. He was brilliant. He was precise. He was respected by everyone who worked for him and feared by most of them. He sat on 3 corporate boards, donated to 2 universities, and owned a private jet he used the way most people use taxis. He had not read a bedtime story to his son in 3 years. It wasn't cruelty. Everyone on the staff understood that. It was grief wearing the mask of distance. Every time Richard looked at Lucas, he saw Elena's face, the same dark lashes, the same gentle slope of the nose, the same quiet expression, even when the eyes themselves could not see. Lucas had been born with a degenerative retinal condition. By age 4, his vision was fully gone. Elena had spent every day with him learning Braille, learning the paths of the house by heart, turning the whole world into something her son could navigate with confidence and joy. When she died, those lessons stopped. Lucas was 7 now. Quiet, thoughtful. He knew every inch of this house the way a sailor knows tides, not by sight, but by feel and memory. The number of steps from his bedroom to the bathroom, the sound the third floorboard made, the way the air changed near the kitchen, the warmth that came through the east windows every morning just after 7. He was smart, and he was brave in the way that only people who have no choice but to be brave ever truly are. But he was also desperately, achingly lonely. He had a nanny, Mrs. Patterson, a competent woman in her late 50s who made sure he was fed and bathed and dressed and did not fall downstairs. She was not unkind, but she was also not warm. She did her job the way someone fills out a timesheet, correctly, completely, without passion. Lucas had no friends his age. The neighborhood children didn't come to play. His father was a ghost in the same house. The staff were polite but careful. Richard Hargrove had made it clear, without ever saying it directly, that his son was not to be pitted or fussed over. He was to be treated normally, which in practice meant he was treated like a small, fragile problem to be managed rather than a child to be loved. And then, 5 months ago, everything changed. It changed because of a woman named Carmen Mendez. Carmen was 32 years old, originally from Guadalajara, Mexico, raised partly there and partly in a small apartment in Queens where her mother had worked 3 jobs and taught Carmen that dignity was something you carried inside you, not something other people gave you. Carmen had a college degree in hospitality management. She was meticulous, warm, and honest in a way that made people instinctively trust her. She had applied for the head housekeeper position at the Hargrove estate through an agency, interviewed with the estate manager, and been hired on a Thursday afternoon in late September. She had one condition when she accepted the job. Her daughter came with her. The estate manager had hesitated. Richard Hargrove had paused when it was relayed to him. A toddler in the house. Underfoot. Possibly loud. Possibly messy. Almost certainly a disruption to the clean, controlled order of the household. Richard had almost said no. He said yes, but only because the agency told him that Carmen Mendez was the best candidate they had seen in 5 years, and his estate manager, a practical man named Douglas, said quietly, "Sir, if you pass on her over a child, I think you'll regret it." Richard grunted, said fine, went back to his phone call. He had no idea what he had just let into his home. Her name was Rosie. She was 2 years and 8 months old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her late grandfather's stubborn chin, and a laugh that sounded like someone had taught bells to be joyful. She toddled through that echoing mansion like she had been sent there on purpose, like someone, somewhere, had known exactly what this house needed. She needed 4 days to find Lucas. And 4 minutes after that, they were best friends. The first time Rosie saw Lucas, she was sitting on the kitchen floor eating a piece of mango that Marcelo the chef had cut for her, because Marcelo, who was famously impatient with everyone, had taken one look at Rosie and immediately become a completely different human being. Lucas came into the kitchen the way he always did, slowly, one hand trailing along the wall, the white cane in his right hand tapping a quiet rhythm on the tiles. He knew the kitchen by sound and smell. Coffee always. Something savory or sweet depending on the hour. The low hum of the refrigerator. The particular acoustic quality of the room, slightly more live than the hallway because of the tile floors and the high ceiling. He stopped when he heard something new. A small sound. Soft and wet. Mango being eaten by someone very small, and very happy about it. "Who's there?"
Lucas asked.
His voice was careful, the way it always was with strangers, not afraid, just precise. Gathering information. Rosie looked up at him with mango juice on her chin. She said, in a voice that treated this as the most normal thing in the world, "Me, Rosie. I'm Lucas." "I know," Rosie said, as though she had always known. Lucas cocked his head. "How do you know?" Rosie thought about this with the profound seriousness of someone who is almost 3. "Mama say, Lucas is the boy upstairs." "Upstairs," Lucas corrected, automatically, and then felt embarrassed about it. "Sorry. Upstairs," Rosie repeated, unbothered. Then she held up a piece of mango toward him specifically, angled correctly, as if she could somehow tell that pointing it at his face was the right direction, and said, "Want some?" Something happened to Lucas's face then. Something small and enormous at the same time. The careful, composed expression that 7 years of navigating a difficult world had put there. It shifted. Just for a second. Like a curtain moving in a window. He sat down on the kitchen floor next to her. Marcelo, watching from across the kitchen, pretended to be very busy with a pot. "Yes, please," Lucas said. And that was the beginning. Over the following weeks, Rosie and Lucas constructed a friendship that the adults around them watched with a mixture of bewilderment and something close to reverence. It didn't follow any rules they recognized. Rosie didn't treat Lucas as blind. She didn't treat him as special or fragile or different. She treated him the way a puppy treats everyone, with total, uncomplicated enthusiasm and a complete lack of agenda. She talked to him constantly about everything. The color of the flowers in the garden, the way the clouds looked that morning, what Marcelo was wearing, what she had dreamed about. The things she said were often nonsensical and always vivid, and Lucas absorbed them like someone who had been in a dark room for years and had forgotten that other people could see the walls. "The flower is red today," Rosie would announce, sitting beside him in the garden. "Which flower?" "That one." A pause. Then, remembering, "The tall one, near the rock." "The rose?"
"No."
"The other one." "The tulip?"
"Yes."
"Tulip." She stretched the word out like taffy. "It's very red, like your sweater but more red." Lucas smiled. He smiled often now. The staff noticed. Mrs. Patterson noticed and wasn't entirely sure how to feel about it. Douglas, the estate manager, noticed and mentioned it quietly to Richard one evening. Richard said, and returned to his laptop, but he thought about it at 2 a.m. when he couldn't sleep, which was most nights. What no one fully understood, except maybe Carmen, who watched her daughter with a quiet and knowing love, was what Lucas gave Rosie in return. He listened to her. Not the way adults listen to toddlers, half present, indulgent, waiting for the cute part to be over. Lucas listened the way only someone who has learned to live entirely through listening can. When Rosie spoke, he heard everything. The hesitation before she said something she wasn't sure about. The particular brightness in her voice when she was describing something she loved. The slight drop in tone when she was tired. He heard her. And for a small child who spent her days in a house full of busy adults who loved her but were always occupied, that hearing was a gift she didn't have a word for yet, but felt completely. He also kept her safe in his own way. Not from physical danger, that would soon be entirely reversed, but from the particular loneliness of being small in a big world. When Rosie got frustrated trying to reach something and started to cry, Lucas was the one who said, calmly, "Tell me where it is, and I'll get it." When she had a bad dream and toddled down the hallway at night and ended up outside the kitchen crying softly. It was Lucas who heard her, because Lucas always heard things others missed, and called out from his room, "Rosie, is that you? It's okay. I'm right here." Carmen would find them sometimes in the morning. Lucas sitting in the doorway of his room, Rosie asleep against his shoulder, both of them calm in the particular way of people who have found someone they trust completely. She would stand in the hallway and let herself feel the fullness of it before gently waking them. This was the friendship that had built itself, quietly and completely, in the echoing mansion on the Upper East Side. This was what was at stake on the morning everything nearly broke. It was a Wednesday in late February, the kind of New York winter morning that looks beautiful through glass and is merciless outside of it. The sky was that particular shade of pale gray that comes before snow. The radiators in the mansion clicked and hissed. Marcelo was making oatmeal. Carmen was on the third floor changing the linens in the guest suite. Mrs. Patterson was on her phone. She would carry that fact, was on her phone, like a stone in her chest for the rest of her life. Not because she was negligent in any grand sense. She was always on her phone. She answered emails, checked weather, texted her sister in New Jersey. It was a small and constant habit that had never mattered before that morning. Lucas had woken early, as he often did. He was a light sleeper, attuned to the sounds of the house changing as the night shifted toward morning. He had his routine: wake, wash, dress himself with the careful independence he had been trained to take pride in, retrieve his cane from beside the bed, and make his way toward the breakfast room. But that morning, something interrupted the routine. He heard something in the east corridor. A sound he couldn't immediately identify. A kind of rustling, like paper or fabric, and then a soft mechanical beep that his mind cataloged as new, unrecognized, possibly interesting. Lucas was 7, and he was curious in the way only children who can't see are curious, because the entire world is a mystery to be solved through sound and touch, and the thousand small details that sighted people walk past without noticing. He turned toward the sound, away from his usual path, away from the familiar sequence of steps and turns and landmarks he knew by heart, into the east corridor, which was less traveled, less memorized, less known. His cane moved ahead of him.
Tap, tap, tap.
The sound continued. He followed it. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that the east corridor opened at its far end into the mezzanine landing. A wide, beautiful, completely open mezzanine with a half-height railing that Elena Hargrove had chosen because she loved the feeling of space, of light, of the atrium below. A railing that came up to Elena's hip and came up to Lucas's chest and did not reach anywhere near enough to stop a forward fall if someone walked into it at momentum. 22 feet to the marble floor below. He was 12 feet away from it. Walking. The sound he was following, a balloon. One of the get-well balloons from the arrangement sent by a business colleague 2 days ago, broken free of its ribbon, drifting down the east corridor in the current of warm air from the radiators. It had caught on the railing now, bobbing gently, making the faintest crinkle of mylar. Lucas didn't know about the railing. He didn't know about the drop. He knew only that he was in unfamiliar territory, and his cane was tapping, and the floor felt the same, and the sound was close now. 8 feet.
6.
Down the hallway, 40 feet back, a small door opened. Carmen's laundry room, adjacent to the guest suite. Rosie had been in there with her mother, sitting on a basket, but toddlers do not sit still for long, and she had slipped out while Carmen's back was turned, a thing she did with the regularity and creativity of someone who has made escaping into an art form. Rosie padded out into the hallway on bare feet. Her pajamas had little bears on them. Her hair was loose, dark and curly, still slightly wild from sleep. She had a biscuit, a digestive biscuit that Marcelo slipped her every morning like a secret, in her left hand. She looked down the east corridor. She saw Lucas. She saw the railing. Children that age do not have the same architecture of fear as adults. They don't calculate. They don't think in those sequential words, he is about to walk into that railing and fall. But something in Rosie, something below language, below thought, in the deep and ancient place where love lives before it learns to speak, understood that something was wrong, that her Lucas was going somewhere he shouldn't go. She ran, bare feet on marble, the biscuit still in her left hand. No hesitation, no calculation, no pause. She was not a fast runner. She was 2 years and 9 months old, and her legs were short, and she ran the way all toddlers run, with her whole body, a kind of organized falling forward, arms out, completely committed. Lucas was 5 feet from the railing. Rosie was behind him by 10 feet, closing. 3 feet. 8 feet. 1 foot. She reached him. She grabbed the back of his pajama shirt with her right hand, the hand without the biscuit, and she pulled. She pulled with everything in her, with the whole small, fierce weight of her body leaning backward. Lucas stopped. The momentum shifted. He stumbled backward a half step. His cane, swinging forward in the arc of the next tap, struck the railing with a metallic clang that rang through the atrium below and bounced off the high ceiling and came back down. He froze. He heard the sound of the cane on the railing. He heard the change in the acoustic, the openness, the depth, the way sounds fell away below rather than bouncing back. He felt the air moving upward from the atrium. He understood in an instant everything he had almost done. "Lucas," Rosie said, still holding his shirt, breathing hard from the run.
No.
"Stop." He didn't move.
He didn't speak.
He just stood there, 1 foot from the edge, with a toddler's fist wrapped in the back of his pajama shirt, and felt his heart hitting his ribs like it was trying to get out. "Bad place," Rosie added, with the authority of someone who has spoken the final word. Then she pulled him backward, step by step, 3 steps, 4, until they were safely in the middle of the corridor. Then she let go of his shirt. Then she took a bite of her biscuit. Lucas sank to his knees on the marble floor. He didn't cry. He was too shocked to cry. He just knelt there, shaking slightly, one hand on his cane, the other pressed flat on the cold marble, feeling how solid and safe and real it was. Rosie crouched down in front of him, at his level, and looked at his face for a long moment. Then she reached out and patted his cheek. Once, twice. The way her mother patted her cheek when she was scared. "Okay now," she said. The security camera at the end of the east corridor captured all 11 seconds of it. 16 floors away, in an office building in Midtown, a phone was about to ring with the most important call Richard Hargrove would receive in 3 years. Richard Hargrove had been in meetings since 6:45 that morning. He operated on a schedule that his assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Kira, described privately to her friends as designed for a man who has decided to live nowhere. Every hour was accounted for. Every conversation had a purpose. Every purpose had a metric. He moved through his days with the absolute conviction of someone who has confused motion for living and productivity for meaning. At 9:17, his personal phone buzzed on the conference table. He ignored it. His policy in meetings was no interruptions. At 9:18, it buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. Douglas. His estate manager never called twice. Richard held up a hand to pause the meeting. "Douglas." "Sir." Douglas's voice was controlled, but only just. "I need you to come home." "Is Lucas?"
He's fine. He's physically fine.
Sir, you need to come home. There's something you need to see. 40 minutes later, Richard Hargrove was sitting in the security room of his own home, watching the footage from the East Corridor camera. He watched it once. Then he asked Douglas to play it again. And again. He watched his son walk toward the edge of the mezzanine. He watched the distance close, 5 feet, 3 feet, 1 foot. He watched a tiny girl in bare pajamas sprint down the corridor with a biscuit in her hand and grab the back of his son's shirt and pull. He watched Lucas fall to his knees. He watched Rosie pat his cheek and say something the camera couldn't capture, but that Douglas had told him, "Okay now." The third time he watched it, Richard Hargrove did something that Douglas, who had worked for him for 9 years, had never seen him do. His face broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was quiet and total, the way a dam breaks not in the movies but in real life, not with explosion but with a slow, unstoppable giving way. He put his hand over his mouth and he sat very still and he let it happen. Douglas stepped out of the room, closed the door softly behind him, stood in the hallway and looked at the ceiling and gave his employer the only thing a man in that moment truly needs, space and dignity, and the knowledge that no one is watching. Inside the room, Richard was doing something he had not allowed himself to do in 3 years. He was feeling things in their full size instead of behind the thick glass of work and distance and the daily armor of being Richard Hargrove. He was feeling how close it had been. 22 feet of air and marble. His son's cane touching a metal railing.
One more step.
He was feeling the weight of 3 years in which he had been in this house, but not in his son's life. 3 years of letting Mrs. Patterson manage and Douglas oversee and Marcello feed and everyone else maintain, while he moved through the upper floors and the car and the office, efficient and purposeful and completely, catastrophically absent. He was feeling something else too. Gratitude of a size and kind he had no previous experience with. For a woman named Carmen Mendez, who had asked for one condition and whom he had almost turned away. For a little girl in bare pajamas who didn't know what a mezzanine was and didn't know what a drop was and just knew that her friend was going somewhere wrong. He played the footage one more time. He watched Rosie pat Lucas's cheek. He watched his son's shaking hand press flat to the marble floor. Richard Hargrove stood up, straightened his jacket from pure muscle memory, walked to the door, and went to find his son. Lucas was in the garden. It was cold, February cold, snow threatening, and Mrs. Patterson had put a coat on him but hadn't stayed outside herself because it was cold, and she saw no pressing reason to stand in cold when she could see him through the glass. Lucas was sitting on the stone bench near the rose bed, his cane across his knees, his face turned up toward the gray sky the way blind people sometimes do. Not to see it, but to feel it, to let the cold air and the smell of winter and the particular silence of a garden before snow tell them something about the world. Richard stopped in the doorway for a moment. He looked at his son, really looked, and saw, for the first time in 3 years, not the ghost of Elena's face, but simply Lucas, his child, 7 years old, sitting alone in a cold garden because there was no one to sit with him. He walked down the steps. Lucas heard his footsteps. He always heard footsteps, and his whole body changed in the way it did when he recognized someone. Usually it was a small, polite adjustment. This time something else moved through him. Something complicated and huge and not entirely resolved.
Dad.
His voice was careful. Douglas said you came home. I did. Richard sat down on the bench beside him. He had not sat on this bench in 3 years. The cold of the stone came through his suit trousers immediately. He didn't move. They sat in silence for a moment. The garden was still. Somewhere above the wall, a cab horn sounded, muffled by distance. "I watched the camera footage," Richard said. Lucas nodded slightly. He knew it existed. He had known every day for 3 years that the cameras watched everything, and that somehow the person who most needed to see had always been elsewhere. "I'm sorry," Richard said. It came out directly. No preamble, no qualification, none of the precision he usually brought to every sentence. Just the 2 words, dropped into the cold air between them. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Are you sorry about this morning? Or the other mornings?" It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Richard Hargrove in 3 years. His son, 7 years old. No vision, no capacity to read expressions, nothing to rely on but the precise truth of words. Richard felt it land exactly where it was meant to. "The other mornings," he said. "All of them." Lucas said nothing. But something in his shoulders, the permanent, subtle brace that had been there so long Richard hadn't noticed it until this moment, loosened. Just slightly, like a rope given a half-inch of slack. "Rosie says you're not supposed to cry," Lucas said, "because it makes your nose hurt." Richard looked at his son. "Is that what she says?" "She says it with great authority." A sound came out of Richard Hargrove then, short and rough and startled. A laugh, a real one, the kind that comes without permission, the kind he had not produced in 3 years. In the kitchen, through the glass, Marcelo watched the 2 figures on the bench and quietly set down his wooden spoon and did not pick it up for a full minute. Carmen Mendez was called to Mr. Hargrove's study that afternoon. She came the way she always went everywhere, composed, upright, meeting whatever was in front of her with the full and steady force of herself. But her hands, which she kept folded in front of her, were not entirely still. She had watched the footage too. Douglas had shown her, quietly, while Rosie was napping. Carmen had watched her daughter run, had watched those small bare feet and the biscuit-filled hand and the moment of contact, the pull, the saving. She had watched it without sound, in the small security room, and had felt something move through her that didn't have a name. Pride and terror and love and the delayed vertigo of understanding how close everything had come to being different. Richard Hargrove stood up when she entered. Carmen was briefly surprised by this. In her experience, powerful men did not stand when household staff entered rooms. "Please sit down," he said. She sat. He sat. On the desk between them, a manila envelope. Beside it, a folded document. Carmen looked at them, but said nothing. "I asked Douglas to prepare something," Richard said. He spoke precisely, as always, but something underneath the precision had changed. Like architecture after an earthquake, the walls still standing, but with a new awareness of how walls can fall. "I want to explain it to you before you open it." Carmen waited. "Your daughter saved my son's life this morning." He said it plainly. Not with the drama of someone telling a story, but with the weight of someone stating a fact that still hasn't fully been absorbed. "There is no version of this where I sit across from you and pretend that's a small thing, or an ordinary thing, or a thing that I repay with a bonus in an envelope." Carmen's composure didn't crack, but her eyes, for just a moment, went very bright. "I've been thinking since this morning," Richard continued, "about what I can actually offer you that is proportional to what your daughter did. I'm a man who has spent his life believing problems can be solved with money if you apply enough of it. I'm aware that's not what's true today, but I can do certain things. Practical things. And I would like your permission to do them." He slid the envelope across the desk. Carmen opened it. Inside was a letter. A formal document from Hargrove Capital's legal department. It outlined the following: a housing grant, a 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side, owned outright by a Hargrove Capital Foundation, transferred to Carmen Mendez's name. A full educational trust for one Rosie Mendez, funded for schooling from kindergarten through university. A salary renegotiation that more than doubled what Carmen currently earned. And a document that wasn't legal in nature, but was the one Richard had written himself, by hand, on plain paper, which simply said, "Your position in this home is permanent for as long as you want it. This is not employment. This is family. R. Hargrove." Carmen read it all. She set it down on the desk. She looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the snow had begun, small flakes, barely there, the beginning of something. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Rosie didn't do it for any of this."
She doesn't know what she did.
To her, Carmen stopped, collected herself. She just saw her friend going somewhere wrong. "I know," Richard said. "That's exactly it. That's the whole thing." He paused. "She has an extraordinary daughter." Carmen looked at him for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "You have an extraordinary son." Richard was quiet. He has been the most patient, the most kind, the most gentle friend to Rosie since the day she found him. He listens to her. He treats her like she matters. To Rosie, going to work with me is the best thing in the world because Lucas is here. Carmen's voice was steady, but full. Children learn how to love from the people around them. Rosie didn't run toward that railing because she's brave. She ran because she loves Lucas. And she loves Lucas like that because he showed her what that kind of attention feels like. Richard sat with that for a long moment. "I've been a poor example," he said quietly. "You're still here," Carmen said. It was not forgiveness, not exactly, not yet. But it was the opening through which forgiveness might eventually walk. Later that afternoon, Carmen found Rosie in the garden with Lucas. The snow was barely there, but Rosie was treating each flake as a personal gift, spinning in circles with her face turned up, mouth open. Lucas was sitting on the bench, laughing, really laughing, at the sound of her spinning and the occasional tiny impact of snowflakes landing and Rosie's exclamations. "Got one. Got a snow. Lucas, it's cold. Another snow." Carmen stood in the doorway and did not go inside for a long time. Douglas appeared beside her at some point. They stood there together in companionable silence, watching. 14 years in this house," Douglas said quietly. "I've never heard that boy laugh like that." Carmen said nothing. She just watched her daughter spin in circles in the snow, and the boy on the bench who was listening to her with his whole self, and she felt the particular emotion that has no single word in English, the feeling of witnessing something precious that almost wasn't. Spring came to the Hargrove mansion differently that year. Not in the obvious ways. The garden was always maintained, the flowers always planted by the landscape team on schedule, the iron gates always polished. Those things were the same. What was different was inside the house. The echo was changing. It was slowly, imperfectly, haltingly, with setbacks and awkward moments and evenings that fell short, filling up. Richard Hargrove began coming home before 8. It started the Thursday after the morning of the mezzanine. He came home at 6:45 and stood in the hallway not entirely sure what to do with himself. Kira, his assistant, had blocked 7 to 9 p.m. in his calendar simply as home, and had done it with a decisive click that said she had been waiting years to do exactly this. He found Lucas and Rosie in the library. Rosie was sitting in the big leather armchair that had been Elena's, sitting in it the way toddlers do, sideways and slightly upside down, legs over one arm, head dangling off the other. She was dictating to Lucas the elaborate plot of something that was either a dream she'd had or a story she was inventing, with no discernible boundary between the two. Lucas was sitting on the footstool beside the chair, nodding seriously, asking clarifying questions. And the dragon was purple, Rosie was saying. Purple. Okay. Then what? Then he was also green. At the same time? Yes, Rosie said, with great confidence. Purple and green. She searched for the comparison, like broccoli. Broccoli isn't purple. Some broccoli, Rosie said. Lucas considered this. I'll allow it. Richard stood in the doorway unnoticed. He was almost afraid to speak. The moment was so complete, so self-contained, so improbably lovely, that announcing himself felt like walking onto a stage mid-scene. Rosie noticed him first, because Rosie always noticed things that moved, had excellent peripheral vision, and also had Carmen's instinct for reading rooms. Mr. Richard, she announced, untangling herself from the chair with the controlled chaos of a toddler in motion. We're making a story. I can hear that, Richard said, crouching down to her level because something told him to, some new instinct he was learning. Is the dragon still alive? Rosie looked at him with the evaluating stare of a 2-year-old. Then she looked at Lucas. You can tell him, Lucas said, if you want. Rosie looked back at Richard. Then she took 2 steps toward him and grabbed his hand and started pulling him toward the library chair. Sit, she commanded. I'll tell from the beginning. Richard allowed himself to be led. He sat in the armchair. Rosie climbed into his lap, uninvited, unambiguous, completely convinced of her right to be there. And Lucas turned on the footstool to face him, and Rosie began again. There was a dragon. He was purple and also green like broccoli. His name was, she paused, making the name up in real time. Gary. Richard Hargrove, CEO, board member, Forbes listed, feared and respected in rooms with marble floors and corner offices, sat in his dead wife's armchair with a toddler in his lap and his blind son on the footstool, and listened to a story about a dragon named Gary. He listened to the whole thing. When it was over and the dragon had apparently made friends with a cloud and moved to the moon, Richard looked at his son. Lucas was smiling. It was Elena's smile. He could see it now without flinching. Not the ghost of someone gone, but the continuation of something living. That was the best dragon story I've ever heard, Richard said. It's the only dragon story you heard, Lucas pointed out, which makes it the best by default. Lucas grinned. In the weeks that followed, this became the new shape of the evenings. Richard came home. He sat with Lucas. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to be present in a way that was useful rather than just physical. He learned to narrate things for Lucas the way Elena had, not with pity, but with precision and warmth. He learned that his son had opinions about everything, sharp and well-formed and funny, and that he had simply not been asking. He and Carmen came to an understanding that was built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than employer and employee, though it remained that formally. She navigated it with the same grace she brought to everything. There were boundaries and there was warmth and there was always the absolute bedrock of the 2 children at the center of it all. Lucas began school that spring, a proper school for blind students with an immersive curriculum and children his age, and a music program that discovered, within his first week, that he had perfect pitch. He came home the evening of that discovery and found Richard in the study, and stood in the doorway and said, "Dad, I can hear every note." Richard set down his pen. "Tell me." And Lucas sat down and talked for 45 minutes about sound and music and the way notes fit against each other and the color he sometimes imagined when a particular chord resolved, and Richard sat across from him and did not look at his phone once. Rosie turned 3 that April. Carmen asked what Rosie wanted for her birthday. Rosie thought about it with tremendous seriousness and then said, "A cake with Lucas and Mr. Richard." Carmen made the cake herself. Chocolate, because Lucas said that was Rosie's favorite, and Carmen was briefly struck by the fact that her daughter's blind friend knew her preferences more precisely than most adults in her life. Marcelo added the decorations, but had the grace to let Carmen present it. They ate it in the garden on a Sunday afternoon. The 4 of them, Carmen, Rosie, Lucas, and Richard, at the garden table with mismatched plates because Rosie had insisted on choosing them herself, and her criteria were aesthetic in ways only she fully understood. Rosie blew out 3 candles. Lucas said, "I can hear you blowing," and Rosie thought this was the funniest thing she had ever heard and laughed until she had to put her face in Carmen's shoulder. Richard watched them. He felt, sitting at that table in the spring light, something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not happiness exactly. Happiness felt thin and temporary for what this was. Something deeper. Something like the return of a self that had been stored away. Later, after Rosie had fallen asleep in her chair and been carried inside by Carmen, Richard and Lucas sat alone in the garden for a while. The evening was warm now. The first real warmth of the year. Lucas said, quietly, "Dad." "Yeah. I'm glad you came home." He didn't mean that evening. He meant February. He meant the bench in the cold. He meant the 45-minute conversation about music and the bedtime stories Richard had started reading again, and the morning 2 weeks ago when Richard had said, simply, "Tell me what you hear," and Lucas had spent an hour describing the soundscape of the waking city from his bedroom window, and Richard had listened and said, "I had no idea," and meant it completely. "I am too," Richard said. The garden was quiet. In the kitchen, they could hear Marcelo singing something in Italian. From Rosie's room, Carmen's voice, low and warm, the ending words of a bedtime story in Spanish that Rosie demanded in the original language, every night, without exception. Lucas turned his face up the way he sometimes did, not to see the sky, but to feel the evening on his skin, the particular warmth and depth of it, the way it carries sound and smell, and the whole texture of a world made of things other than vision. "She really ran?" he asked. "Not for the first time." "All the way down the corridor?" "All the way," Richard said. "Biscuit and everything." Lucas smiled. "She never drops the biscuit," he said, with deep admiration. "She's had that biscuit in every emergency I've ever seen." Richard laughed. And this time the sound rose up from the garden and moved out into the evening, joining Marcelo's singing and Carmen's voice and the faint urban hum of the city beyond the walls, all of it mixing into something that sounded, for the first time in 3 long years, like a home. 2 years and 9 months old. Bare pajamas. A biscuit in one hand. She ran toward danger without a thought in her small, brave, loving head. And somehow, in those 11 seconds, she pulled 4 people back from the edge. Not just Lucas. All of them. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that love doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it's 3 feet tall, eats biscuits, and knows exactly when to run. Before you go, I just want to say thank you for being part of this channel. If these stories bring you comfort, inspiration, or simply brighten your day, you can support the channel by clicking the thanks button below the video. Your support helps me continue creating more heartfelt stories for this wonderful community, and truly, every bit of support means the world to me. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being here.